When cinema scholars write about movies, their focus invariably is on directors. Writers get mentioned occasionally, if they're lucky. For today's film, a 1948 production from RKO called Berlin Express, I'm going to start off talking about the producer. Now, unless they're the stature of a Selznick or a Goldwyn, producers rarely rate in any film discussion. If they do, they're usually depicted as enemies of the artists passionately trying to create something unique and compelling. Well, Berlin Express was the passion project of its producer, Burt Granitt. He'd worked in movies since the early 30s, writing loads of B pictures before catching on at RKO during the war years as a writer and producer. He became good pals with actress Lorraine Day when he produced a couple of her wartime comedies, 1944's Bride by Mistake, and Those Endearing Young Charms, released the following year. But Granitt was chafing at the bit. He was one of those guys who wanted to push the envelope and try new things. Finally, in 1946, he got his wish. He cast Lorraine Day completely against type in a complex, multi-layered psychological thriller called The Locket. Its success earned him a chance to do something else out of the ordinary. Well, by then the war was over, and Granitt was fascinated by events unfolding in post-war Europe, specifically how the Allied forces, the US, England, France, and Soviet Union, were cooperating tenuously at times to broker a restructuring of Germany. Now, he needed to see it for himself, so he traveled through the war-ravaged terrain by train, documenting everything with a 16mm camera. And along the way, he came up with an idea, a story about a group of train passengers heading to an international peace conference. They'd represent the various Allied nations and get thrown together to uncover a conspiracy with global consequences. Granitt developed the story with German émigré writer Kurt Siodmak, brother of the great German director Robert Siodmak. And the focus became the Allied effort to root out Nazi terrorists who'd gone underground and were attempting to reform the Reich, a very real situation. Now, RKO liked the idea so much, it gave Granitt its A-team, director Jacques Tourneur and cinematographer Nicolas Musuraca, who together had just created one of the quintessential film noirs, Out of the Past. But Merle Oberon, cast somewhat awkwardly as the French member of the Allied collective, insisted that Lucien Ballard be the DP on the film. And that's not only because they were married, but because Ballard had developed a special lighting rig that helped hide the scars on Oberon's face that she'd suffered in a 1937 auto accident. Now, this rig became a standard piece of equipment called an Obi in the actress's honor. It's Ballard's location shooting, in fact, that makes Berlin Express distinctive and historically significant. Burt Granitt convinced RKO and the Allied governments to let him film in Frankfurt and Berlin, making this the first Hollywood production shot within the occupied zones of post-war Berlin, which annoyed the hell out of Billy Wilder. He'd spent most of 1945 and 46 in Germany, appointed by the U.S. government to oversee denazification of the entertainment industry. And while there, Wilder came up with his own idea for a movie set in the post-war rubble. But by the time he got back to Berlin in the summer of 47, Granitt and his team were already underway. And since equipment was so scarce, it had to be shared on a first-come, first-served basis. And that's why Wilder's A Foreign Affair was the second Hollywood film shot in occupied Berlin. And Granitt's picture also beat Wilder's into American theaters by 1 month, opening in May 1948. Making this picture was not easy. All the rubble and ruins are real, and movement through the various zones was not only logistically complicated, but something of a political minefield. But as Burt Granitt said when I interviewed him years ago, the war managed to save us about $65 million in sets. Realizing the difficulties inherent in this production, but sensing that something special was in the offing, RKO gave Granitt an especially long shooting schedule. And this made director Jacques Tourneur happy because he never used second units. He believed every image was vital and trusted no one else to film the passage work. Now, one note, the Gare de l'Est train station you see early in the film as the characters are introduced is not the actual station in Paris. It's a replica built in Hollywood to accommodate Tourneur's complicated shooting scheme. Well, amazingly, the film still came in $100,000 under budget, a credit to Granit's preparation and Tourneur's efficiency. It's tricky to meld unfolding global events into a fast-paced mystery thriller. Here, necessary background info is spelled out in a voiceover for the less informed. Granit tested a ration of real radio announcers, but rejected them all because their style didn't mesh with his approach. He considered having Robert Ryan do the narration, but that only complicated things since he plays one of the main characters. Finally, Granit settled on actor Paul Stewart, a recognizable voice from dozens of noir films, and Stewart nails it. If only he could have done all those omniscient voiceovers in crime movies. Screenwriter Harold Medford accomplishes the tricky task of weaving geopolitics into a plot that needed to satisfy an audience craving a thriller more than a history lesson. Now, the ride may get a little bumpy at times, but there's plenty of extraordinary and historical scenery, and plenty of twists and turns on the route. From 1948, all aboard the Berlin Express.